She was just the cleaning lady who wiped away what others left behind. But he saw in her something she didn't even know she carried, an ancient sacred pain. And between fear and fascination, she whispered, "Take it off, I can't stand it." If you like love and romance stories, watch until the end. Subscribe to this channel and leave your comments saying where you're listening from. Never been seen. Only noticed when she got in the way. Clara Mills was a shadow in the pristine corridors of Argenta Tower, where powerful men didn't need to remember the names of the women who swept away their excesses. At 29, she lived beneath the beige uniform of the contracted cleaning service and beneath the weight of a promise that had become her most intimate prison, to die without ever being touched by desire. Born in a cramped terraced house in Oldham, Clara had escaped home as a teenager, fleeing from a father who confused authority with violence. On the last night she spent beside her mother, she heard whispered in desperation, "Don't let any man break you from inside. Keep what's yours." Since then, Clara had made a silent vow of purity, not as faith but as defense. Virginity was her shield against the world, the only territory still intact in her existence. Living alone in a tiny bedsit in Tower Hamlets, her days repeated in exhausting cycles of sweat and silence. The morning alarm at 4:30, the tube journey into the city of London pressed against bodies that smelled of yesterday's ambitions and today's fears. The Argenta Tower rose 57 floors into the grey London sky, a monument to money that scraped against clouds heavy with rain that never seemed to wash the city clean. Clara's world existed in the spaces between importance. She mopped floors where million-pound deals were struck, emptied bins filled with discarded dreams and crumpled contracts, wiped down surfaces that reflected faces she was never meant to see clearly. The other cleaners, mostly women like her, mostly invisible, moved through the building like ghosts in beige uniforms, speaking in hushed tones about children at home, about bills that multiplied faster than hope, about men who drank too much or loved too little. She had learned to make herself smaller, quieter, translucent. When executives passed her in corridors, their eyes slid over her as if she were furniture. When she accidentally bumped into someone important, the apology fell from her lips like a reflex, automatic and meaningless. She was the human equivalent of background noise, present but unregistered, essential but unacknowledged. The top floors of Argenta Tower were different. The air itself seemed more expensive, filtered and perfumed with success. Here the carpets were thicker, the art was real and the silence had weight. Clara cleaned these floors only on Fridays after hours, when the building emptied of its daytime inhabitants and became something closer to a cathedral, holy and hollow and echoing with the prayers of money. It was on one such Friday evening, as autumn rains streaked the floor-to-ceiling windows and the city below blurred into watercolors of light, that Clara's carefully ordered world tilted off its axis. She had been assigned the 57th floor, the penthouse level that housed the office of Dante Ferraz, the man whose name was spoken in the building with the reverence usually reserved for natural disasters. Clara knew the stories, whispered in the break rooms and murmured over shared cigarettes on fire escapes. Dante Ferraz, 42 years old, former British Army officer, turned digital security mogul, the man who sold protection to politicians and businessmen across the globe, who turned paranoia into profit and fear into fortune. He was the kind of wealthy that transcended mere money. He owned senators, bought judges, and collected secrets like other men collected stamps. The stories painted him as a man carved from granite and shadow. They said he never smiled, never raised his voice, never needed to. They said his wife had died in a bombing in Syria, that he had gone into the wreckage with his bare hands to pull out pieces of her, that he had never been the same. They said he lived alone in his glass tower, surrounded by screens and cameras, and the conviction that love was a mistake one made only once. Clara had never seen him. The penthouse floor was usually cleaned by Maria Santos, a Portuguese woman who had worked in the building for 15 years and spoke about Dante Ferraz with a mixture of fear and maternal concern. But Maria's daughter had been rushed to hospital with appendicitis, and Clara found herself holding the electronic key card to the 57th floor. Her reflection multiplied infinitely in the polished steel of the lift doors. The lift rose through the building's vertebrae, carrying her past floors of lesser ambitions, Past the offices of men who were rich but not wealthy, powerful but not untouchable. The numbers climbed like a prayer. 45, 46, 47. At 57, the doors opened with a whisper of expensive engineering, and Clara stepped into another world. The penthouse office was a study in controlled violence. Everything was sharp angles and clean lines, black leather and steel that gleamed like surgical instruments. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around 3 sides of the space, offering a view of London that made the city look like a circuit board spread beneath the sky. The Thames wound through it all like a silver wire, connecting past to future, power to power. Clara moved through the space like a trespasser in a temple. She had learned to clean around importance, to make herself invisible, while making everything else immaculate. But here, surrounded by the artifacts of incomprehensible wealth, a painting that might have been a Rothko, a desk that looked carved from a single piece of ebony, chairs that probably cost more than her annual salary, she felt the weight of her own smallness pressing down like gravity. She worked methodically, professionally, the way she had been trained. Dust the surfaces that were already spotless, polish the glass that was already transparent, empty the bins that were already empty. The routine was meditative, almost religious in its repetition. But tonight something was different. Tonight the penthouse didn't feel empty. Clara paused, her cloth hovering over the surface of the vast desk. The silence had texture here, layers of quiet that seemed to breathe. And beneath it, almost inaudible, she heard something that made her blood freeze in her veins. Crying. Not the soft, feminine weeping of romantic films, but something raw and broken and male. The sound of a soul cracking open in private, the kind of grief that lived in the spaces between public faces and private truths. It was coming from behind a door at the far end of the office, a door she had been told never to open, never to clean beyond. Clara should have left. Should have packed her supplies, taken the lift down 57 floors and pretended she had heard nothing. But something held her frozen in place. Not curiosity exactly, but a recognition. She knew the sound of pain trying to hide itself. She had made that sound herself, muffled in pillows and buried in the darkness of nights that stretched like years. The crying stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse, pregnant with awareness and shame. Clara began to back toward the lift, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for flight. But she was too late. The door opened, and Dante Ferraz stepped into his office like a man walking into his own execution. He was not what the stories had led her to expect. The whispers had painted him as a monster, all teeth and claws and barely contained violence. But the man who stood in the doorway was something far more dangerous. He was human. Tall, yes, with the kind of build that spoke of discipline and physical power. His dark hair was streaked with silver at the temples, and his face carried the kind of scars that come from living too close to the edge of the world. But his eyes were the color of winter storms, gray-green and full of weather. He saw her immediately. Of course he did. This was a man who noticed everything, catalogued threats and weaknesses with the efficiency of a machine designed for survival. Clara waited for the explosion, for the anger that would strip her naked with words, for the phone call that would end not just her job, but any hope of employment in her field ever again. Instead, Dante Ferraz looked at her with something that might have been recognition, as if he had been expecting her, as if she was not an intruder but an inevitability. "You're not Maria," he said, his voice carrying the faint trace of an accent she couldn't place. It was a statement, not a question, delivered without heat or judgment. "I'm sorry, sir," Clara managed, the words scraping past the desert that had once been her throat. "Maria's daughter is in hospital. I was asked to cover her shift. I didn't mean to disturb—" "You didn't disturb anything," he interrupted, but gently, as if she were made of something fragile that might shatter under the weight of careless words. "What's your name?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke. Clara felt the urge to lie, to give him a false name that would protect her real self from whatever this moment was becoming. But lies required energy she didn't have, and something in his storm-grey eyes demanded truth. "Clara," she whispered. "Clara Mills." He repeated her name like he was tasting it, rolling the syllables around his mouth as if testing their weight. "Clara Mills." Then, almost to himself, "Of course." The silence that followed was dense with meaning she couldn't decipher. Rain continued to streak the windows, turning the city below into something impressionistic and strange. Clara became aware of her own breathing, of the way her uniform felt suddenly too tight, of the fact that she was alone with the most dangerous man in London and had absolutely no idea what happened next. "You heard," Dante said, and it wasn't a question. Clara considered lying again, but found herself nodding instead. "I'm sorry. I should have left. I didn't mean—" "Tut. Everyone cries," he said, cutting through her apology with surgical precision. "But not everyone admits it." He moved to the window, placing one hand against the glass, as if he could feel the pulse of the city through his palm. "How long have you worked here, Clara Mills?" 3 years, sir. 3 years of being invisible." Again, not a question. Clara found herself studying his profile against the backdrop of London's lights. There was something carved about him, as if he had been shaped by forces that left no room for softness. But the tears she had heard, they spoke of something different, something that could still break. "Do you like being invisible?" he asked, turning to face her again. The question caught her off guard. No one had ever asked her that before. No one had ever suggested that invisibility might be a choice rather than a circumstance. "It's safer," she said, surprising herself with the honesty. "Safer than what?" "Safer than being seen." Something shifted in his expression, a recognition that went deeper than names or faces. He looked at her as if she had just spoken a password he had been waiting his entire life to hear. "And what happens when someone sees you anyway?" he asked softly. Clara's chest tightened. The question felt like a trap, but not the kind designed to hurt, more like the kind that might set something free. "I don't know," she admitted. "It's never happened before." Dante moved closer, not enough to threaten, but enough to make her acutely aware of the space between them. He was tall enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes, and when she did, she found herself falling into something that felt like recognition. "It's happening now," he said. The words hung in the air like a challenge or a promise. Clara felt something inside her chest unfurling, something that had been clenched tight for so long she had forgotten it was there. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like to be seen, really seen by someone who looked like they understood what it cost to hide. But then reality crashed back in like cold water. This was Dante Ferraz, the man who owned buildings and bought politicians and probably had people killed with the casual efficiency of ordering coffee. This was a conversation that could end her career, her life, her carefully constructed safety. This was exactly the kind of danger her mother had warned her about. "I should go," she said, reaching for her cleaning supplies with hands that trembled just slightly. "Finish my rounds." "Yes," he agreed, but made no move to step aside. "You should." Neither of them moved. The moment stretched between them like a wire under tension, ready to snap or sing. Clara found herself memorizing details she had no business noticing, the way his expensive shirt was slightly wrinkled, as if he had been sleeping at his desk. The faint scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, the way he breathed, deep and controlled, like a man used to managing his body like a weapon. "Clara," he said, and her name in his mouth sounded different than it ever had before. "Not diminished or dismissive, but substantial, real, sir. When you clean this office, do you read?" The question was so unexpected that she almost laughed. "Read, sir?" "The books on my desk. The papers left open. Do you read them?" Clara thought of all the documents she had cleaned around, all the contracts and correspondence that passed through her peripheral vision like background noise. She had trained herself not to see, not to process, not to remember. "No, sir. I don't read anything that isn't my business." "And what is your business, Clara Mills?" "So I'm making things clean." "Nothing else?" The question felt loaded with implications she couldn't decode. Clara found herself thinking of the book hidden in her locker downstairs, Milan Kundera's The Unbearable Lightness of Being, something she had picked up from a charity shop and read in fragments during her breaks. She thought of the notebooks full of half-formed thoughts she kept beside her narrow bed, the stories she told herself in the darkness when sleep wouldn't come. "Nothing that matters," she said finally. Dante moved then, walking to his desk and picking up a slim volume she hadn't noticed before. He held it out to her, and she saw that it was the same Kundera novel she had been reading in secret. "This was left on the cleaning cart last week," he said. "Maria mentioned that one of her girls was reading it. I thought you might find it interesting." Clara stared at the book as if it were a bomb. There was no way this was coincidence. No way he didn't know exactly who had been reading it, exactly whose hands had worn the pages soft with repeated handling. "I've already read it," she said carefully. "Have you? What did you think?" The question was casual, conversational, but Clara sensed deeper currents beneath the surface. This felt like a test, though she couldn't tell what the right answer might be. "I think," she said slowly, "that lightness and weight are both unbearable in their own ways. That we spend our lives trying to find the balance between floating away and being crushed." Dante's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes intensified. He placed the book back on his desk, never breaking eye contact. "Most people find it pretentious," he said. "Most people are afraid of questions that don't have answers." "And you're not afraid?" Clara thought of all the ways fear had shaped her life, all the choices she had made from a place of terror, disguised as prudence. "I'm afraid of everything," she said. "But some things are worth being afraid of." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither of them was quite ready to cross. Clara felt exposed, as if she had just removed some essential piece of armor and was waiting to see whether he would use the vulnerability against her. Instead, Dante nodded as if she had just confirmed something he already knew. "Thank you for your honesty," he said formally, stepping back and breaking the spell that had fallen over them. "Please don't let me keep you from your work." The dismissal was polite but clear. Clara gathered her supplies, her hands moving automatically while her mind reeled from whatever had just happened. As she reached the door, his voice stopped her. "Clara." She turned back and found him watching her with an expression she couldn't read. "I'll see you next Friday." It wasn't a question. It wasn't quite a command. It was something else entirely, a statement of intention that made her stomach flutter with something that might have been anticipation or terror. Clara nodded and fled. The ride down 57 floors felt like falling through time. By the time she reached the ground floor, she was almost convinced the entire encounter had been a hallucination, brought on by exhaustion and too many nights of broken sleep. But when she touched her cheek, she found it was burning. And when she looked at her reflection in the lift's polished doors, she saw something in her own eyes she had never seen before. She looked like a woman who had been seen. The thought terrified and thrilled her in equal measure, and as she walked out into the London night, Clara Mills began to understand that her carefully constructed world of invisibility had just cracked open like an eggshell, and there was no putting it back together again. The week that followed their encounter stretched before Clara like a suspension. Bridge over an abyss, each day another. Step across something that might collapse beneath her weight. She found herself watching the clock with an intensity that bordered on obsession, counting not just hours but minutes until Friday evening would arrive again, until she would climb those 57 floors and discover whether the moment in Dante's office had been real or just another of the elaborate fantasies her mind constructed to make the emptiness bearable. Sleep became elusive, fractured into fragments that left her more exhausted than rest. When she did manage to drift off, her dreams were invaded by storm-grey eyes and the memory of her name spoken like a secret. She would wake with her heart racing and her skin flushed, reaching for something that wasn't there, mourning something she had never possessed. The other cleaners noticed her distraction. Fatima, a Bangladeshi woman who worked the lower floors and spoke in quick, nervous bursts about her 5 children back in Dhaka, commented that Clara looked like she had seen a ghost. Elena, a Polish grandmother who cleaned the executive offices with the efficiency of someone who had survived far worse than demanding employers, observed that Clara was walking differently, like someone carrying a secret too heavy for her frame. But it was Maria Santos who cornered her in the supply closet on Wednesday afternoon, her dark eyes sharp with the kind of maternal concern that could strip flesh from bone. "What happened up there?" Maria asked without preamble, blocking the door with her substantial frame. At 53, she had raised 6 children and buried a husband, and she possessed the particular variety of intuition that came from decades of reading faces for signs of trouble. "Nothing happened." Clara lied, but her voice cracked on the words like ice under pressure. "Mija, I've been cleaning that man's office for 15 years. I know the difference between nothing and something." Maria's accent thickened when she was concerned, her Portuguese heritage bleeding through the careful English she had cultivated. "He called me yesterday. Asked about you. Clara's blood turned to mercury in her veins. What did he ask? Questions about your background, your family, whether you were... Maria paused, searching for the right words. Whether you were trustworthy. The word hit Clara like a physical blow. Trustworthy. As if she were a thing to be evaluated and categorized, a potential asset or liability in some equation she didn't understand. What did you tell him? The truth. That you work harder than anyone, never take anything that isn't yours, never gossip about what you see. Maria stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. But Clara, listen to me. Men like Dante Ferraz, they don't ask questions about cleaning ladies unless those cleaning ladies have stopped being invisible. And when women like us become visible to men like him, it's never just about curiosity. The warning hung between them like smoke from a distant fire. Clara wanted to dismiss it, to convince herself that Maria was overreacting, seeing threats where none existed, but she had felt the weight of Dante's attention, the way it seemed to strip away all her carefully constructed defenses and leave her exposed. I can't afford to lose this job, Clara said, hating how small her voice sounded. That's not what I'm worried about you losing, Maria replied. Thursday passed in a haze of routine and anticipation. Clara moved through her duties like a sleepwalker, mopping floors that didn't need mopping, dusting surfaces that held no dust. She found herself taking different routes through the building, avoiding the lifts that led to the upper floors, as if physical distance could somehow diminish the pull she felt toward the 57th floor. But even 40 stories below, she could feel him. It was ridiculous, impossible, the kind of thinking that belonged in trashy romance novels and teenage fantasies. Yet every time she passed a window, she found herself looking up, searching for a glimpse of movement behind the glass walls of his penthouse. Every time her phone buzzed with a work notification, her heart hammered with the irrational hope that it might be from him. It wasn't until Thursday evening, as she was preparing to leave the building, that she found the first gift. It was small, unobtrusive, a book tucked into her locker with no note, no explanation. But she recognized it immediately. A first edition of Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, its leather binding worn soft with age and handling. Clara had mentioned the novel once, months ago, in passing conversation with Elena about books that had changed their lives. She had said it was the first book that made her understand that a woman's interior life could be as vast and complex as any man's, that thoughts and feelings could be architecture, building entire worlds inside the confines of a single day. There was no way this was coincidence. The book must have cost more than Clara made in a month, and it had been placed in her locker with the precision of someone who knew her schedule, her movements, her most private spaces. The implications made her hands shake as she held the volume, feeling the weight of intention behind the gesture. Inside the front cover, written in handwriting she didn't recognize, but somehow knew belonged to him, were 4 words. For your invisible architecture. Clara pressed the book against her chest and felt something crack open inside her, not breaking, exactly, but shifting like tectonic plates adjusting to accommodate new pressures. She understood with a clarity that was both thrilling and terrifying that this was how seduction worked at the highest levels. Not flowers and chocolates and crude propositions, but the recognition of one's deepest self reflected back like light off water. She should have returned the book, should have marched up 57 floors and placed it on his desk with a polite but firm refusal, should have rebuilt her walls and reinforced her defenses, and reminded herself of all the reasons why women like her didn't get involved with men like him. Instead, she took it home. Friday arrived like a storm system, heavy with atmospheric pressure and the promise of lightning. Clara dressed with unusual care, choosing the one blouse she owned that wasn't entirely shapeless, the one that suggested the existence of a female form beneath her uniform. She told herself it was professional pride, that she simply wanted to look competent and reliable. But when she caught her reflection in the tube window on the way to work, she saw a woman preparing for battle, not cleaning. The day dragged like torture. Clara found herself making mistakes she hadn't made since her first week, knocking over a wastebasket, leaving streaks on a window, forgetting which offices she had already cleaned. Her supervisor, a thin man named Robert who smelled perpetually of instant coffee and disappointment, pulled her aside during lunch break. "Mills, What's wrong with you today? You're acting like you've never held a mop before. Sorry, sir. Just tired. Well, wake up. You're doing the 57th floor again tonight, and I don't want any complaints from upstairs. Management's been asking questions about our service quality. The words hit her like an electric shock. Management asking questions, which could only mean one thing. Dante had been inquiring about her, and not necessarily in ways that would protect her position. Questions about what, sir? Above my pay grade, Mills. Just do your job and keep your head down. But keeping her head down was no longer an option. Clara had crossed some invisible line in that penthouse office, and there was no crossing back. Evening came with the weight of inevitability. Clara gathered her supplies and rode the lift to the 57th floor, her heart beating a rhythm that sounded like his name. Dante, Dante, Dante. The doors opened onto the familiar landscape of controlled power, but something was different. The office felt occupied in a way it hadn't the week before, as if his presence had somehow seeped into the walls and furniture. He was waiting for her. Dante stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, silhouetted against the London skyline, like a figure cut from black paper. He didn't turn when she entered, but she could feel his awareness of her like heat radiating from a flame. "Thank you for the book," Clara said to his back, her voice steady despite the chaos in her chest. "Did you read it?" "I've read it before, but I read it again." And Clara moved deeper into the office, her cleaning supplies forgotten. And I think Virginia Woolf understood something about the spaces between moments. The way a single day can contain entire lifetimes if you know how to look. Dante turned then, and she saw that he was wearing jeans and a simple white shirt instead of his usual suit. The casual clothes made him look younger, more human, and somehow infinitely more dangerous. "What else did you think?" The question was a challenge and an invitation. Clara felt herself standing at the edge of something vast and unmappable, a territory that extended far beyond books and literary analysis. "I think," she said carefully, "that Clarissa Dalloway spent her whole life behind glass, looking at the world but never quite touching it. I think she was afraid that if she reached out, she might shatter everything, including herself." "And is that what you're afraid of, Clara?" Shattering. The directness of the question stole her breath. No one had ever asked her that before. No one had ever looked at her with the kind of intensity that suggested her answer mattered, that her interior landscape was worth exploring. "I'm afraid of shattering other people," she said, surprising herself with the honesty. "How could someone like you shatter anyone?" "You don't know what I'm capable of." Dante moved closer, closing the distance between them with the measured pace of someone who understood the mathematics of approach and retreat. "Then tell me." Clara laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You want me to confess? To tell you all my secrets, so you can catalogue them and file them away with the rest of your intelligence? I want you to tell me because I think you've been carrying them alone for too long." The words hit her like a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs and leaving her gasping. Because he was right. She had been carrying her secrets alone, building walls around them so high and thick that sometimes she forgot they existed at all. "My father," she began, then stopped. The words felt rusty from disuse, like machinery that hadn't been operated in years. "What about your father?" "He was a violent man. Not just physically, though there was that too, but violently disappointed. In life, in my mother, in me. He had these expectations about what women should be, how they should behave, what they owed to the men in their lives." Clara wrapped her arms around herself, trying to contain the memories before they could escape and contaminate the air around them. "When I was 16, he arranged for me to marry the son of his friend, a boy who was just like him, angry and entitled and convinced that having a penis made him the center of the universe." Dante's expression darkened, but he didn't interrupt. "I ran. Left everything, my mother, my home, what little education I had. Came to London with nothing but the clothes on my back and a promise I made to myself that no man would ever own me the way my father thought he owned my mother. And you've kept that promise." "It wasn't a question." Clara nodded, feeling the weight of 29 years of celibacy and self-protection settling around her shoulders like armor. "Until now," she whispered. The admission hung between them like a live wire. Dante was close enough now that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and subtle that made her think of dark wood and deeper waters. close enough that she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the silver threading through his hair, the small scar that bisected his left eyebrow. "Clara," he said, and her name was a question and a prayer and a threat all at once. "This is insane," she breathed. "You could have anyone. Supermodels, socialites, women who know how to navigate your world. Why me? Because you're not trying to navigate my world. You're trying to survive it." The distinction hit her like a revelation. All her life, she had thought survival was about making herself smaller, quieter, less threatening to the men who held power over her circumstances. But here was a man who recognized her survival instincts, not as weakness but as strength, not as submission but as strategy. "And because," Dante continued, reaching up to touch her face with fingers that trembled almost imperceptibly, "when I look at you, I remember what it feels like to be human." His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone, and Clara felt her carefully constructed defenses crumbling like ancient walls under siege. She should step back, should remember all the reasons why this was impossible, why women like her didn't get happy endings with men like him. Instead, she leaned into his touch. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted, "neither do I." The confession was so unexpected that Clara almost laughed. Here was one of the most powerful men in London, admitting uncertainty, admitting vulnerability. It was like watching a god confess to mortality. "You've done this before," she pointed out. "I've had sex before. I've been married before. But I've never done this, whatever this is, before." The distinction mattered. Clara understood that he was drawing a line between the mechanical act of physical intimacy and something deeper, more complex, more dangerous. Something that required not just bodies but souls, not just desire but trust. "What if I disappoint you?" she asked. "What if you don't?" The question reframed everything. Instead of focusing on the ways she might fail to meet his expectations, he was asking her to consider the possibility that she might exceed them. It was a perspective so foreign to her experience that she felt dizzy trying to accommodate it. "I've never," she began. "I know." "How?" Dante's smile was soft, almost sad. "Because you carry yourself like someone who's never been properly touched. Like someone who's been holding her breath for so long she's forgotten how to exhale." The accuracy of his observation was devastating. Clara felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, though whether from relief or terror she couldn't say. "I'm not good enough for this," she whispered. "Good enough for what?" "For you. For this world. For whatever you think you see in me." Dante's hand moved to cup the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in her hair with a gentleness that made her knees weak. "Clara, listen to me. I've spent my entire adult life surrounded by people who think they're good enough for me. Politicians who sell their souls for my campaign contributions. CEOs who compromise their ethics for my security contracts. Socialites who spread their legs for my bank account." His voice was rough, raw, with something that might have been pain, "and not one of them, not one, has ever looked at me the way you looked at me last Friday night." "How did I look at you?" "Like I was worth saving." The words broke something open inside her chest, something that had been sealed tight for so long she had forgotten it existed. Clara felt tears spill down her cheeks, not from sadness but from the overwhelming relief of being seen, really seen, by someone who understood what it cost to build walls around yourself. "I can't promise you anything," she said, through her tears. "I'm not asking for promises." "What are you asking for?" Dante leaned forward until his forehead touched hers, until they were sharing breath and space, and the kind of intimacy that had nothing to do with bodies and everything to do with recognition. "One night," he said softly. "Just one night where we both stopped being afraid of shattering." Clara closed her eyes and felt herself falling, not into his arms, exactly, but into the possibility of arms, the possibility of trust, the possibility that maybe, just maybe, she was worth more than the sum of her fears. "Not here," she whispered. "Where?" "I don't know. Somewhere that feels less like a cage." Dante pulled back just enough to look at her, his grey-green eyes searching her face for signs of doubt or deception. "My flat," he said finally. "It's not far from here. We could just talk, if that's all you want." But they both knew talking wasn't all either of them wanted. The air between them was thick with desire and possibility, and the kind of electric tension that made ordinary conversation impossible. "Okay," Clara said, the word barely more than a breath. They left the building together, side by side but not touching, like two people walking parallel paths that might converge or diverge, depending on forces beyond their control. The night air was sharp with autumn and exhaust fumes, and the particular scent of London rain held in suspension, waiting to fall. Dante's car was waiting in the building's private garage, a sleek black thing that probably cost more than Clara would earn in a lifetime. But he didn't drive like a man showing off his wealth. He drove like someone who understood that the space between departure and arrival was sacred, that anticipation was its own form of intimacy. They didn't speak during the drive. Words seemed inadequate to the magnitude of what was happening between them, the tectonic shift in Clara's carefully ordered universe. Instead, she watched London slide past the windows like scenes from someone else's life. The Thames reflecting streetlights like scattered coins, couples huddled together on park benches, the warm glow spilling from pub windows onto wet pavement. Dante's flat was in Canary Wharf, high enough to make the city look like a constellation spread beneath them. It was beautiful in the way that money could make things beautiful, all clean lines and expensive materials, and the kind of sterile perfection that suggested a designer rather than an inhabitant. But there were details that spoke of the man who lived here. A chess set, with pieces carved from what looked like bone and obsidian, photographs of places that looked like war zones, books in languages Clara couldn't identify stacked on every available surface, and on the mantel above a fireplace that had probably never held actual fire, a single framed photograph of a woman with dark hair and laughing eyes. "Your wife," Clara said, though it wasn't really a question. "Sophia. She died 3 years ago." "I'm sorry." Dante moved to pour himself a drink from a crystal decanter that caught the light like captured fire. "She would have liked you. You don't know that. She had a theory about people, said you could tell everything you needed to know about someone by watching how they treated the people who couldn't do anything for them." He took a sip of whatever was in his glass. Whiskey? Probably something that cost more than Clara's monthly rent. "You're kind to the security guards. You remember the names of the other cleaners' children. You say please and thank you to people who don't expect it from someone in your position." The observation was so specific, so detailed, that Clara realized he had been watching her long before their encounter in his office. The thought should have been disturbing, but instead she found it oddly comforting. He hadn't just noticed her in a moment of vulnerability. He had been seeing her, really seeing her, for months. "Were you happy?" she asked. "With her?" Dante was quiet for so long that Clara thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with something that might have been grief or regret or both. "I thought I was. But happiness is a luxury when you're building an empire. I was too busy conquering the world to appreciate the woman who was conquering me. And now? Now I understand the difference between having someone and holding them." The distinction hit Clara like a physical blow. She thought of all the ways people could possess each other without ever truly connecting. All the marriages and relationships that were really just elaborate forms of mutual ownership. "Is that what you want from me?" she asked. "To hold me?" Dante set down his glass and turned to face her fully. In the soft light of his expensive apartment, he looked younger and older at the same time. Younger because of the vulnerability in his eyes, older because of the weight of experience that had carved lines around them. "I want to learn how," he said simply. The honesty of the admission undid her completely. Clara felt herself moving toward him before she was conscious of the decision, drawn by something deeper than desire, stronger than fear. When she reached him, she lifted her hand and placed it flat against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heart beneath her palm. "I don't know how to be held," she whispered. "Then we'll learn together." Dante covered her hand with his, and Clara felt the last of her defenses crumble like walls built on sand. She looked up into his storm-grey eyes and saw her own reflection there, not diminished or distorted, but clarified, as if his gaze had the power to show her who she really was beneath all the fear and protective armor. "Clara," he said, and her name was a question she finally knew how to answer. "Yes," she breathed, and felt the word reshape the architecture of her world. They came together like two people, recognizing each other across a crowded room, like puzzle pieces that had been searching for their match without knowing what they were looking for. Dante's lips found hers with a gentleness that made her cry, and Clara tasted salt tears, whether his or hers she couldn't tell. But even as they kissed, even as she felt herself melting into him like snow in sunlight. A small voice in the back of her mind whispered warnings about consequences and complications and the thousand ways this could destroy them both. She ignored it. For the first time in her life, Clara Mills chose to be brave instead of safe, chose to reach instead of retreat, chose to trust that maybe, just maybe, she was worth the risk of shattering. But then, just as Dante's hands moved to frame her face, just as she felt herself surrendering to something larger than fear, her phone buzzed with a text message. The sound cut through the moment like a blade, sharp and intrusive and wrong. Clara pulled back, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "I should check." "Leave it," Dante said softly, his hands still cupping her face. "Whatever it is can wait." But Clara was already reaching for her phone, driven by the compulsive anxiety of someone whose life had taught her that unexpected messages usually meant disaster. The number was unknown, but the words that appeared on her screen made her blood turn to ice. "I found you." That was all. 3 words that contained the power to destroy everything she had built, everything she had become. Clara's hands began to shake, the phone slipping from her nerveless fingers to clatter on Dante's expensive marble floor. "What is it?" Dante's voice was sharp with concern, all traces of romantic softness evaporating as he shifted into what Clara was beginning to recognize as his military mode. "I have to go," Clara said, already backing away from him, already rebuilding the walls he had so carefully torn down. "I'm sorry, I can't. This was a mistake." "Clara, wait." But she was already moving toward the door, driven by panic older and deeper than desire. She had been stupid to think she could have this, selfish to imagine that her past would simply stay buried while she played at being someone else. "Please," Dante called after her. But Clara was already in the hallway, already summoning the lift, already planning her escape route back to the safety of invisibility. The ride down felt like falling through the center of the earth. Clara's reflection stared back at her from the polished walls, eyes wild with fear, lips swollen from kissing, the ghost of his touch still burning on her skin. She looked like a woman who had been awakened from a deep sleep, only to discover that her dreams were nightmares after all. By the time she reached the street, London had started to rain, the kind of fine, persistent drizzle that soaked through clothes and skin and settled into bones like grief. Clara walked without direction, letting the water wash away the scent of his cologne, the memory of his hands, the taste of possibility on her tongue. Her phone buzzed again. Another unknown number, another message that made her stomach clench with recognition. "We need to talk." Clara stopped walking and found herself standing outside a 24-hour cafe in Shoreditch, its windows glowing warm yellow against the rain-dark street. Through the glass she could see night shift workers and insomniacs, and lost souls like herself, seeking refuge from the city's indifference. She pushed through the door and ordered tea she didn't want, then found a table in the back corner where she could watch the entrance and catalogue exits, old habits, learned from a childhood that had taught her the importance of always knowing which way to run. The man who entered 20 minutes later was familiar and strange at once, like looking at a distorted reflection of herself. He had her dark hair, her sharp cheekbones, her way of moving through space as if apologizing for taking up room. But where Clara had learned to make herself invisible, he radiated a kind of desperate visibility, as if he were shouting to be seen. Marcus. Her half-brother, though they had never used that word when they were children. He was the son her father had always wanted, born to the woman he'd married after Clara's mother had finally found the courage to leave. Marcus was 2 years younger than Clara, but he carried himself like someone who had lived a dozen lifetimes, all of them hard. He slid into the booth across from her without invitation, his eyes scanning the cafe with the paranoid efficiency of someone who had learned not to trust closed spaces. "Hello, Clara." His voice was rougher than she remembered, scarred by cigarettes and shouting and years of swallowing things that should have been said. "Marcus." She kept her voice neutral, professional, as if he were a client rather than the ghost of a life she'd thought she'd escaped. "How did you find me?" "You're not as invisible as you think. Took some doing, but I've gotten good at finding people who don't want to be found." He signaled the waitress for coffee, though his hands were already shaking enough to suggest he'd had plenty. "Nice little life you've built here, quiet, safe, boring. What do you want?" Marcus laughed, but the sound held no humor. "Straight to business. I always liked that about you, Clara. No small talk, no pretending we're family. We're not family. We share the same father. We share the same sperm donor. There's a difference. The distinction hit its mark. Marcus's jaw tightened, and Clara saw the flash of their father's anger in his eyes, the same look that had preceded fists and broken furniture, and promises that tomorrow would be different. "He's dead," Marcus said abruptly. Clara felt something inside her chest shift, like ice cracking on a lake. She had been waiting for this news for 13 years, had imagined how she would feel when it finally came. Relief, she had thought, justice, freedom. Instead, she felt nothing at all. That's when? 6 months ago. Liver failure. Died alone in a council flat in Rochdale, choking on his own vomit. The clinical description was delivered without emotion, but Clara could hear the hurt beneath the hardness. Despite everything, Marcus had stayed, had tried to save a man who couldn't be saved, had loved someone who didn't know how to love back. "I'm sorry," Clara said, and meant it, not for their father's death, but for the burden Marcus had carried alone. "Are you? Because you ran, left me there with him, left me to deal with his rage when he couldn't take it out on you anymore." The accusation hung between them like smoke. Clara had known this moment would come eventually, had known that her escape had consequences for the people she'd left behind. But knowing and facing were different things. "You could have left, too," she said quietly. "I was 14. I was 16. You were always stronger." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. She had never felt strong, only desperate, only afraid, only determined to survive by whatever means necessary. "What do you want, Marcus?" He leaned forward, his eyes bright with something that might have been fever or fanaticism. "I want justice." "For what?" "For her." Clara's blood turned to mercury. She knew immediately who Marcus meant, though the name hadn't been spoken between them. "Don't." "Rebecca was pregnant, Clara. Did you know that?" Clara's vision blurred. Rebecca, Marcus's girlfriend when he was 16, a girl with honey-colored hair and bruises she tried to hide with makeup. Her girl who had looked at their father with the same fear Clara had learned to wear like skin. "Marcus, don't do this." She was going to leave him. Finally found the courage to pack her bags and get out. But he found out about the baby and he... Stop. Made sure she wouldn't embarrass the family. Made it look like an accident. The words hit Clara like bullets, each one tearing through carefully constructed barriers. She had suspected all those years ago, had seen the fear in Rebecca's eyes turn to resignation, had noticed how their father's rage had shifted from explosive to calculating in the weeks before the girl's death. "You don't know that," Clara whispered. "I know. I saw the medical records. I talked to the doctor who examined her body. Our father killed her, Clara. Killed her and his grandchild, and no one ever paid for it." The cafe around them faded into background noise. Clara felt herself shrinking, becoming 16 again, powerless again, complicit in her silence. "What does this have to do with me?" Marcus smiled, and the expression was so cold that Clara barely recognized him. "I've been watching you, Clara, following your life, your routines, your patterns. I know about your job, your flat, your careful little existence. And I know about him." "Who?" "Dante Ferraz, the billionaire in the tower, the man whose office you clean, whose attention you've somehow caught." Marcus leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The man who has blood on his hands." Clara's world tilted on its axis. "That's not Afghanistan 2019, a village called Kala Enau. Ferraz was leading a private security operation, supposedly protecting aid workers. But his team opened fire on a wedding party. 37 civilians dead, including 12 children. You're lying. Am I? His military records are classified, but money talks and I've learned how to listen. Your boyfriend is a war criminal, Clara. A man who kills innocents and profits from chaos." The accusations hit Clara like physical blows. She thought of Dante's hands on her face, his voice when he spoke her name, the vulnerability she had seen in his eyes. It didn't match the monster Marcus was describing. Even if that were true, what does it have to do with Rebecca? Justice is justice. Her father never paid for what he did, but maybe his daughter can help balance the scales. Marcus reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila folder, sliding it across the table toward her. "Everything's in there. Photographs, documents, testimony from survivors. Enough to destroy Faraz's empire and put him in prison for the rest of his life. Why are you telling me this? Because you have access. You're in his building, his office, his life. You could plant evidence. Copy files set him up for a fool that would make headline news around the world. Clara stared at the folder as if it were a snake that might strike at any moment. You want me to frame him? I want you to expose him. For crimes he may not have committed, for crimes he definitely committed. The only question is whether you have the courage to do what's right. The word courage hit Clara like a slap. She thought of all the times she had chosen safety over righteousness, invisibility over action. But this felt different. Not like courage, but like vengeance. Not like justice, but like manipulation. And if I refuse? Marcus's expression hardened. Then I'll find another way. But Clara, listen to me. I know about tonight. I know you were at his apartment. Know you've been getting close to him. If you think you can play both sides, if you think you can protect him while staying safe yourself, you're wrong. Is that a threat? It's a warning. There are people who want Faraz dead, Clara. People with more resources than I have, more reason to see him suffer. If you get caught in the crossfire, I won't be able to protect you. Clara felt the last of her illusions crumble like castles made of sand. The fairy tale was over before it had really begun. She was not Cinderella, Dante was not a prince, and there would be no happily ever after for women who forgot their place in the world. How long do I have? She asked, her voice barely audible. 1 week. After that, I take the information to the press myself. And whatever happens to you happens. Marcus stood, leaving the folder on the table between them like evidence of a crime not yet committed. I'm sorry, Clara. I know you wanted something different, but we don't get to choose our battles. They choose us. He walked away without looking back, leaving Clara alone with the weight of impossible choices and the ghost of a future that would never be. Outside, London continued its nightly dance of light and shadow, beauty and brutality, hope and heartbreak. Clara stared at the folder for a long time, then slipped it into her bag and walked back out into the rain. Above the city, in a penthouse apartment in Canary Wharf, Dante Faraz stood at his window and watched the lights below blur and shift like stars seen through water. His phone had buzzed 17 times since Clara had fled his apartment, but he hadn't looked at the messages. He knew that whatever had driven her away was bigger than desire, deeper than fear. He also knew that he would fight for her, even if it meant fighting against ghosts he couldn't see and enemies he didn't yet understand. In the rain-dark streets below, Clara Mills walked toward a choice that would define the rest of her life, carrying secrets that could destroy them both, and a love she was already beginning to mourn. The war between their worlds had begun, though neither of them knew it yet. But London knew. London always knew when blood was coming, when its ancient stones would be washed clean again by human frailty and the terrible mathematics of desire. The folder burned like a brand against Clara's ribs, where she had hidden it beneath her uniform. For 3 days she carried Marcus's accusations through the corridors of Argenta Tower, like poison in her bloodstream, each step taking her closer to the man, whose destruction lay folded in manila pages against her heart. She had read the documents until the words blurred together, military reports written in the sterile language of acceptable casualties, photographs that turned her stomach and made her hands shake, testimony from survivors whose faces haunted her dreams. If Marcus was telling the truth, if these papers were genuine, then the man whose lips she could still taste was responsible for horrors that defied comprehension. But that was the problem, if. Clara had learned long ago not to trust anything that came from her father's bloodline, had seen how grief and rage could twist truth into something unrecognizable. Marcus had always been the kind of person who saw conspiracies in coincidences, who needed someone to blame for the chaos that had shaped their childhoods. Still, the photographs were difficult to dismiss. Children's bodies arranged like broken dolls in the dust. A bride in a blood-stained white dress, her henna-painted hands splayed against rubble. Men who would never return to families that would spend lifetimes waiting for news that would never come. Clara found herself studying Dante's face during their brief encounters in the building, searching for traces of the monster described in Marcus's files. But all she saw was a man who looked at her like she was the answer to a question he had been asking his entire life, whose hands trembled almost imperceptibly when he touched her arm in passing. who left books for her with passages marked in pencil, not highlighter, she noticed, as if he understood that permanent marks were presumptuous. On Wednesday evening, as she cleaned the 43rd floor, Clara made a decision that felt both inevitable and impossible. She would investigate the allegations herself, not to prove Marcus right or wrong, but to understand who Dante Ferraz really was beneath the layers of wealth and power and carefully constructed mythology. She began small, carefully. During her breaks, she used the building's public computers to search for information about Kala Ino, about British private military contractors in Afghanistan, about the kinds of operations that never made it into official histories. What she found was a labyrinth of classified documents, redacted reports and news articles that raised more questions than they answered. The attack had happened, that much was confirmed. 37 civilians had died during a wedding celebration when private security forces opened fire on what they claimed was a Taliban position. But the details were murky, contradictory. Some reports suggested the contractors had been ambushed and responded in self-defense. Others painted a picture of reckless soldiers firing indiscriminately into a crowd. Dante's name appeared in some of the classified documents Marcus had provided, but never in the public records Clara could access. Either he was very good at covering his tracks, or someone else was very good at creating false evidence. The more Clara researched, the more she realized she was drowning in a sea of competing narratives, each one designed to serve someone's agenda. Truth, she understood, was a luxury in the world of international warfare and corporate security. What mattered was power, money, and the ability to control which version of events became history. By Thursday, the weight of uncertainty had become unbearable. Clara found herself moving through her duties like a sleepwalker, going through the motions of normalcy, while her mind churned with questions that had no clean answers. She avoided the 57th floor, unable to face Dante while carrying Marcus's accusations like a loaded weapon against her chest. But Dante, it seemed, had no intention of being avoided. She was cleaning the women's restroom on the 32nd floor when she heard the door open behind her. Clara didn't turn around. She recognized his footsteps by now, the measured pace of someone who had learned to move through the world with both confidence and caution. "You've been avoiding me," he said without preamble. Clara continued scrubbing a sink that was already spotless, using the repetitive motion to calm her racing heart. "I've been working. Clara." His voice was gentle but firm, the tone of someone who had learned the difference between force and authority. "Look at me." She couldn't, wouldn't, because she knew that the moment she met his eyes, she would either see the monster Marcus had described or the man she was falling in love with, and either revelation would destroy her. "What happened the other night?" Dante asked. "You ran out of my apartment like the building was on fire. I received some troubling news." "About what?" Finally, Clara turned to face him. He was standing in the doorway of the women's restroom, a space where his presence was both inappropriate and somehow necessary, as if normal social conventions had ceased to apply to whatever was happening between them. "About you." The words hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Dante's expression didn't change, but Clara saw something shift behind his eyes, a shuddering, a withdrawal, as if he was already preparing for impact. "What kind of news?" Clara thought of the folder hidden in her locker, of the photographs that had kept her awake for 3 nights, of Marcus's ultimatum counting down like a bomb's timer. She thought of all the ways this conversation could end, and none of them led anywhere she wanted to go. "The kind that makes me question everything I thought I knew about you." Dante stepped into the restroom and closed the door behind him, sealing them into a space that smelled of industrial disinfectant and secrets. He moved closer, close enough that Clara could see the fine lines around his eyes, the silver threading through his hair, the small scar that bisected his left eyebrow. "Then ask me," he said simply. "Whatever you want to know, ask me." The invitation was both a gift and a trap. Clara felt herself standing at the edge of an abyss, knowing that whatever she said next would determine whether they fell together or apart. "Afghanistan," she said, the word falling from her lips like a stone into still water. "Carlos 2019. Dante's face went very still, very pale. For a moment, Clara thought he might deny knowledge, might feign ignorance or confusion. Instead, he leaned back against the tiled wall and closed his eyes. So that's what this is about. You were there. Yes, you led the operation. I was the team leader. Yes, 37 people died. I know exactly how many people died, Clara. I've spent every day of the last 4 years counting them. The pain in his voice was so raw, so immediate, that Clara felt her carefully constructed accusations crumble like sandcastles at high tide. This was not the voice of a man trying to hide his crimes, but of someone carrying their weight like stones in his chest. "Tell me what happened," she said softly. Dante opened his eyes and looked at her with an expression that might have been relief or resignation. "Are you sure you want to know? Because once I tell you, there's no unknowing it. No going back to thinking I might be someone different than who I am." Clara thought of Marcus's warnings, of the folder that condemned Dante with clinical precision, of all the reasons she should walk away and never look back. But she also thought of the man who had noticed her when she was invisible, who had touched her face like she was made of something precious, who had cried alone in his office and trusted her enough to be seen. "I'm sure." Dante was quiet for a long moment, as if gathering the strength to excavate memories that had been buried under layers of guilt and self-preservation. "We were hired to provide security for a medical convoy," he began, his voice carefully controlled. Doctors Without Borders was running a vaccination program in rural Helmand province. Simple job in theory. Escort them to remote villages, provide perimeter security while they worked, escort them back. Clara listened without interrupting, watching his face for signs of deception or rehearsal. But his eyes held the particular kind of distance that came from reliving trauma, the way people looked when they were seeing the past instead of the present. Kala Inao was our third stop that week. Small village, maybe 200 people, mostly farmers and their families. The medical team set up in the village square, while my team established a security perimeter. Everything was routine, peaceful. Children were getting vaccinated. Mothers were asking questions about infant care. Normal day in an abnormal place. His voice cracked slightly on the last words, and Clara saw him swallow hard before continuing. The attack came from 3 directions simultaneously. Coordinated, professional, designed to maximize casualties and minimize escape routes. But they weren't targeting us. They were targeting the villagers, the medical team, the children. Taliban? That's what we assumed. That's what the report said. But I learned later that the attackers weren't Taliban. They were members of a rival tribe, hired by someone who wanted to send a message about cooperating with Western medical workers. Clara felt something cold settle in her stomach. What kind of message? The kind written in blood. The attackers weren't trying to drive us away. They were trying to massacre everyone in that square. Men, women, children, doctors, my team, everyone. Dante pushed himself away from the wall and began pacing the small space, his movements sharp with suppressed energy. My team had seconds to make a decision. We could retreat, leave the villagers and medical workers to die while we escaped to fight another day, or we could engage, knowing that any firefight in a crowded area would result in civilian casualties. What did you do? I chose to fight, gave the order to engage hostiles, knowing that some of the people we were trying to protect would die in the crossfire. The admission hung between them like a blade. Clara felt herself trying to process the mathematics of impossible choices, the calculus of harm reduction in a world where all options led to bloodshed. How many would have died if you hadn't fought back? All of them. 200 villagers, 8 medical workers, 6 members of my team, everyone. And because you did fight back? Dante's hands clenched into fists at his sides. 37 civilians died in the crossfire, but 163 lived. The medical team survived. My team survived. The vaccination program continued. Clara felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, though whether from relief or heartbreak she couldn't tell. The moral landscape Dante was describing was so different from the clear-cut narrative in Marcus's files, so much more complex and devastating than simple villainy. Why didn't you tell your side of the story? Why let people think you were a war criminal? Because 37 innocent people died on my watch under my command because of my decisions. It doesn't matter that more would have died if I'd chosen differently. It doesn't matter that I was trying to save lives. What matters is that I gave the order that ended theirs. That's not how responsibility works. It's exactly how responsibility works when you're the one making the decisions. When you're the one who has to live with the consequences. Dante stopped pacing and turned to face her fully, his storm-gray eyes bright with unshed tears. I could have refused the mission, could have recommended against providing security in such a volatile area, could have insisted on different protocols, better intelligence, more backup. 1,000 small decisions led to that moment, Clara, and I made every single one of them. You can't blame yourself for... I don't blame myself for the attack. I blame myself for not being smart enough, fast enough, careful enough to prevent the casualties, for not finding a third option that would have saved everyone. Clara felt something break open in her chest, not from heartbreak, but from the overwhelming recognition of a man who had been carrying impossible guilt for years. She thought of Marcus's accusations, of the way the files had painted Dante as a monster who killed for profit, and realized how little space there was in the world for moral complexity. The families of the victims, she said carefully. Were they compensated? Every family received more money than they could earn in 10 lifetimes. College funds for surviving children, medical care for the wounded, new homes for those whose houses were destroyed. Not because it was required, but because it was the least I could do. And the medical program? Continued under my personal security for 3 more years. We vaccinated over 50,000 children in that region, built schools, trained local health workers, established supply chains that are still functioning today. Clara felt the last of her suspicions crumble like ancient walls under siege. This was not the profile of a war criminal, but of a man trying to balance scales that could never be balanced, trying to build something positive on a foundation of unavoidable tragedy. Who told you about Afghanistan? Dante asked quietly. Clara hesitated, torn between loyalty to her blood family and something deeper, more fundamental. But she had asked for truth, and truth demanded reciprocity. My half-brother. He wants me to help him destroy you. If Dante was surprised by the revelation, he didn't show it. And will you? I don't know. The honesty of the admission surprised them both. Clara had expected to feel certain by now, to have chosen sides and committed to consequences. Instead, she felt more conflicted than ever, caught between competing loyalties and moral obligations that pulled in opposite directions. What would it take? Dante asked. For you to help him? I don't understand. What would I have to have done? What kind of person would I have to be for you to believe I deserved whatever your brother has planned? Clara thought about the question seriously, turning it over in her mind like a puzzle with pieces that didn't quite fit together. I think, she said slowly, that if you were the kind of person who could order the deaths of innocents without losing sleep, who could profit from others' pain without guilt, who could look at photographs of dead children and feel nothing, then maybe Marcus would be right. Maybe the world would be better without you. And what do you think now? Clara looked at Dante, really looked at him, taking in the lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights, the way his hands trembled almost imperceptibly when he was still, the careful control he maintained over his emotions, like a man constantly keeping dangerous things in check. I think you're a man who made an impossible choice in an impossible situation and has been punishing yourself for it ever since. I think you've built an empire on guilt and used your wealth to try to balance scales that can never be balanced. And I think Marcus doesn't care about justice. He cares about revenge. Revenge for what? Clara felt herself approaching another precipice, another moment where truth would either build bridges or burn them. But she had come too far to retreat into comfortable lies. Our father was a violent man, abusive, controlling, the kind of person who broke things because he could. When I was 16, I ran away rather than marry the man he'd chosen for me. Marcus stayed. And our father, he hurt people. Killed someone, I think. A girl who was trying to leave him. Dante's expression darkened with understanding. And your brother blames you for not staying to protect her. Maybe. Or maybe he just needs someone to blame for all the ways our father poisoned everything he touched. And you're rich, powerful, visible enough to make destroying you feel like justice instead of just another tragedy. They stood in silence for a moment, surrounded by the antiseptic smell of industrial cleaning products and the weight of secrets that had been carried alone for too long. What happens now? Dante asked finally. Clara thought of Marcus's ultimatum, of the deadline that was counting down like a bomb's timer, of all the ways this could end badly for everyone involved. "I don't know," she admitted. "Marcus gave me a week to decide whether to help him expose you. After that, he says he'll go to the press himself. And what will you tell him? First, I need more time." "Time for what?" Clara met his eyes and felt herself falling into something that was deeper than desire, more dangerous than love. She was looking at a man who had shown her his worst moments and deepest guilts, who had trusted her with truths that could destroy him, who had chosen vulnerability over self-preservation. "Time to decide if I'm brave enough to choose you over my family, if I'm strong enough to build something real instead of just surviving in the shadows, if I'm willing to fight for something that might be worth fighting for." Dante moved closer, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, close enough to count the flecks of green in his storm-gray eyes. "And if you decide you're not, then I'll disappear. Leave London, start over somewhere else. Try to forget that I ever knew what it felt like to be seen by someone who understood what he was looking at." "Clara." "But if I decide I am," she continued, cutting off whatever he was going to say, "then I'll need you to promise me something. Anything. Promise me that there are no more secrets, no more hidden truths, no more pieces of your past that might surface to destroy us. Promise me that if I choose to trust you with my life, my future, my heart, you won't make me regret it." Dante cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the lines of her cheekbones with a gentleness that made her want to cry. "I promise you that every terrible thing I've ever done, every mistake I've ever made, every ghost that haunts my sleep, you know about it now. I promise you that if you choose me, you're choosing someone who will spend the rest of his life trying to be worthy of that choice. And if I choose Marcus, if I help him destroy you, then I'll disappear quietly and make sure you're never connected to any of it. I'll protect you even if you choose to destroy me." The promise hit Clara like a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs and leaving her gasping. She had spent her entire life around men who took what they wanted without concern for consequences, who used love as leverage and loyalty as currency. But here was a man offering to sacrifice himself for her safety, to prioritize her well-being over his own survival. "I have to go," she whispered, because staying meant making a choice she wasn't ready to make, and leaving meant preserving the possibility that she might choose correctly when the time came. "I know." But neither of them moved. They stood in the sterile light of the women's restroom, holding each other's faces like they were memorizing the architecture of something they might lose, breathing the same air and sharing the same space, and postponing the moment when reality would intrude and force them back into their separate worlds. "Clara," Dante said finally, his voice rough with something that might have been desperation or hope. "Yes? Whatever you decide. I want you to know that meeting you has been the first good thing that's happened to me in 4 years. You've made me remember what it feels like to want something more than redemption, something better than just surviving until tomorrow." The words broke something open inside Clara's chest, something that had been sealed tight for so long she had forgotten it existed. She felt tears spill down her cheeks, not from sadness but from the overwhelming recognition of being valued by someone who understood what value meant. "I have to think," she said through her tears. "I know. I need time. You have it. I need space. You have that too." Clara pulled away from his hands, immediately missing the warmth of his touch, but knowing that proximity would only make thinking impossible. She gathered her cleaning supplies with mechanical efficiency, trying to rebuild the professional facade that had protected her for so long. But as she reached the door, Dante's voice stopped her. "Clara." She turned back, and found him watching her with an expression she couldn't read. "For what it's worth, I think you're already braver than you know. The woman who confronted me about Afghanistan, who demanded truth instead of comfortable lies, who's willing to risk everything for principle, that woman isn't hiding in shadows anymore." The observation hit Clara like lightning, illuminating corners of herself she had never examined. She looked at Dante and saw herself reflected in his eyes, not diminished or invisible, but substantial, real, worthy of consideration. "Thank you," she said, though the words felt inadequate to the magnitude of what he had given her. Then she left, walking out into the corridor and back into her carefully constructed life, carrying secrets that could save or damn them both, and a choice that would define who she became next. Above them, London stretched out in all directions, like a circuit board of possibilities, its ancient stones holding the weight of 10 million stories about love and loss, choice and consequence, the terrible, beautiful mathematics of human hearts trying to find their way home. That night, Clara sat in her tiny bedsit in Tower Hamlets and stared at Marcus's folder until the words blurred together. She thought about justice and revenge, about truth and narrative, about the difference between accountability and destruction. She thought about a village in Afghanistan where 37 people had died in crossfire, and about a girl named Rebecca who had died in circumstances that might never be fully understood. But mostly, she thought about a man who had trusted her with his worst truths and promised to disappear quietly if she chose to destroy him, who had made her feel seen and valued and worth fighting for. Outside her window, London hummed with its nightly symphony of sirens and traffic and human ambition. Clara closed the folder and made her first real choice in years. Not the choice between Marcus and Dante, not yet, but the choice to stop letting fear make her decisions for her. Tomorrow, she would begin the work of deciding who she wanted to be. Tonight, she would allow herself to imagine that maybe, just maybe, she was brave enough to choose love over safety, trust over certainty, possibility over the known quantities of isolation and regret. The deadline was still counting down, but for the first time in her life, Clara Mills was more interested in what she might build than what she might lose. The decision came to Clara not as a moment of revelation, but as a slow dawn breaking over a landscape she had been learning to navigate in darkness. She woke on Friday morning with a clarity that felt foreign in its completeness, as if all the fractured pieces of herself had finally aligned into something resembling wholeness. She would choose Dante not because he was innocent. She had learned that innocence was a luxury no one could afford past a certain age, but because he was good, not because he was perfect, but because he was trying to be better. Not because loving him was safe, but because it was brave and Clara was tired of being afraid. The choice brought with it a crystalline understanding of what she needed to do next. Marcus's deadline was tomorrow, 24 hours to deliver Dante's destruction or watch him attempt it himself. But Clara had learned enough about her half-brother over the years to know that his version of justice was really just revenge wearing a prettier dress. And she was done being a pawn in games designed by men who confused anger with righteousness. She dressed for work with unusual care, choosing the same blouse she had worn the first night Dante had really seen her. It felt appropriate somehow, like armor forged from moments of recognition rather than steel. She braided her hair back severely, applied lipstick that was just a shade too bold for someone trying to remain invisible, and looked at herself in the mirror of her tiny bedsit bathroom. The woman looking back was not the same person who had hidden behind shapeless uniforms and studied the floor whenever important people passed by. This woman had secrets that could topple empires, love that could rebuild them, and the kind of quiet strength that came from finally understanding her own worth. Clara arrived at Argenta Tower an hour before her shift began and made her way to the staff break room, where she knew she would find Maria Santos preparing for another day of keeping other people's worlds spotless. The older woman looked up from her tea with the maternal concern that Clara had come to both treasure and dread. "Mija, you look different today." "I feel different." "Different how?" Clara sat down across from Maria and tried to find words for the tectonic shift that had occurred, somewhere in the geography of her soul. Like I'm finally awake after a very long sleep. Maria's dark eyes searched Clara's face with the intensity of someone who had learned to read. Trouble in the set of shoulders and the tilt of heads. "This is about him, isn't it? About Señor Ferraz?" "Partly." "Clara, listen to me very carefully. I've been working in buildings like this for 20 years, and I've seen what happens when women like us forget our place in the world. It never ends well. What if I don't want to know my place anymore? What if I want to make my own place?" Maria was quiet for a long moment, her weathered hands wrapped around her tea mug like it was an anchor in choppy seas. "Then you better be very sure that what you're reaching for is worth what you're risking to get it." Clara thought of Dante's hands on her face, his voice when he said her name, the way he had trusted her with truths that could destroy him. She thought of the man who had cried alone in his office and offered to disappear quietly if she chose to break him. "It is," she said with a certainty that surprised them both. The day passed in a blur of routine punctuated by moments of electric anticipation. Clara moved through her duties with mechanical efficiency, while her mind worked through the logistics of what she needed to do. She had Marcus's folder hidden in her locker. All the evidence he believed would destroy Dante arranged in manila pages that felt like holding dynamite. But evidence, Clara had learned, was only as powerful as the narrative that surrounded it, and she intended to control that narrative. At 4 o'clock, 2 hours before the end of her shift, Clara made her way to the 57th floor. She used her keycard with steady hands, rode the elevator up through the vertebrae of London's financial district, and stepped into Dante's office like she was coming home. He was standing by the windows, silhouetted against the city that spread below them, like a circuit board of possibilities. He turned when she entered, and Clara saw surprise and hope and something that might have been relief flicker across his features. "You're early," he said. I made my decision." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge that could support their weight or collapse beneath them. Dante moved closer, his storm-grey eyes searching her face for clues about which way her choice had fallen. "And?" Clara reached into her bag and pulled out Marcus's folder, placing it on Dante's vast ebony desk with the ceremonial precision of someone laying down arms. "I choose you." The relief that washed over Dante's face was so profound that Clara felt her own knees go weak in sympathy. He looked at the folder like it was a bomb that had just been defused, then back at her with an expression she had never seen before. Not just gratitude, but something deeper, more complex. "Clara, but I need you to understand what this means," she continued, cutting off whatever he was about to say. "My brother will go to the press tomorrow with whatever evidence he has. This folder contains copies of everything. It won't stop him, but it might help you prepare for what's coming." Dante nodded, already shifting into what Clara was beginning to recognize as his strategic mode. "What kind of timeline are we looking at?" 24 hours, maybe less. Marcus isn't known for his patience. "And what about you? When this goes public, your connection to me will be scrutinized. The press will dig into your background, your family, your relationship with your brother. Are you prepared for that level of attention?" Clara felt a flutter of fear at the thought of her carefully constructed invisibility being stripped away by cameras and reporters, and the kind of public scrutiny that turned private people into public spectacles. But underneath the fear was something stronger, a determination that felt like steel in her spine. "I'm prepared for whatever it takes to protect what we're building." "What are we building, Clara?" The question was simple, but Clara understood that her answer would define the architecture of whatever came next. She looked at Dante, really looked at him, taking in the hope and vulnerability and careful strength that made him who he was. "Something real," she said finally. "Something that doesn't require either of us to hide or apologize, or pretend to be less than we are." Dante crossed the distance between them in 3 steps, cupping her face in his hands with the same reverence she had seen him show priceless artifacts. "I love you," he said, and the words fell between them like stones into still water, creating ripples that would reshape the landscape of their lives. Clara felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, though whether from joy or fear she couldn't tell. No one had ever said those words to her before, not in any way that mattered, not in any way that felt true. "I love you too," she whispered, and felt the admission reorganize something fundamental in her chest. They came together like two people, recognizing each other across a crowded room, like puzzle pieces that had been searching for their match without knowing what they were looking for. Dante's lips found hers with a desperation that spoke of borrowed time and uncertain futures, and Clara kissed him back with the fierce intensity of someone who had finally learned the difference between surviving and living. But even as they lost themselves in each other, even as Clara felt herself melting into him like snow in sunlight, a part of her mind remained alert, calculating, aware that their enemies were moving and their time was running out. "We need a plan," she said against his lips. "We need more than that," Dante replied, his forehead resting against hers. "We need a miracle." But before Clara could respond, before they could begin to strategize their way through the minefield that lay ahead, Dante's phone buzzed with an incoming call. He glanced at the screen and frowned, his expression shifting from lover to soldier in the space of a heartbeat. "It's my head of security," he said, answering the call. "What is it, James?" Clara could hear only one side of the conversation, but Dante's face told her everything she needed to know. Something was wrong, something immediate and dangerous that required action rather than planning. "How long ago?" Dante asked, his voice sharp with controlled urgency. "Are you certain?" "No, don't engage, just monitor and report. I'll be there in 20 minutes. He ended the call and turned to Clara with an expression that made her blood turn to ice. "Your brother is here, in the building. He's been asking questions about you, about your schedule, about which floors you have access to." Clara felt the world tilt on its axis. "He's not supposed to. The deadline isn't until tomorrow. Men like your brother don't operate on schedules when they smell blood in the water. My security team spotted him in the lobby an hour ago. He's been watching the elevator banks, probably waiting for you to appear." The implications hit Clara like a physical blow. Marcus wasn't just planning to expose Dante tomorrow. He was planning something tonight, something that required her presence and couldn't wait for deadlines or ultimatums. What does he want? My guess? He wants to force your hand, make you choose between me and him in a way that's public, dramatic, impossible to take back. Clara thought of her half-brother's talent for theatrical gestures, his need to be the center of whatever narrative he was constructing. Marcus had always been someone who confused attention with affection, chaos with importance. "We have to get out of here," she said. "No." Dante's voice was firm, carrying the authority of someone who had learned to make decisions under pressure. "Running makes us look guilty, gives him the narrative he wants. We face this here now on our terms. Dante, you don't understand. Marcus isn't just angry, he's unstable. When he doesn't get what he wants, he what?" Clara thought of all the ways Marcus had learned to hurt people when direct confrontation failed, all the tricks their father had taught him about finding pressure points and applying leverage. He finds ways to make you hurt yourself, to make you choose between bad options and worse ones until you're destroying everything you care about with your own hands. Dante's expression darkened with understanding. "Like forcing you to choose between betraying me and protecting him." "Exactly. Then we don't give him that choice. We create a third option." Before Clara could ask what he meant, Dante was moving, pulling out his phone and making calls with the rapid efficiency of someone who had learned to command resources under fire. "James, I need a full security sweep of the building, all floors, all access points. Sarah, I need our legal team on standby and our PR department ready for crisis management. Michael, I need you to pull everything we have on Marcus Mills' background. Finances, connections, anything that might give us leverage." Clara watched him orchestrate a response with the precision of a general preparing for battle and felt a mixture of admiration and terror at the forces he could command with a few phone calls. "What are you doing?" she asked. "I'm turning the tables. Your brother thinks he's controlling the narrative, but he's about to discover that he's been playing chess while I've been playing war." Within minutes, Dante's office had transformed into a command center. His security team fed him real-time intelligence about Marcus's movements through the building. His legal team provided analysis of the documents in Marcus's possession, and his PR department began crafting responses to whatever accusations might surface. But Clara felt increasingly uneasy as she watched the machinery of wealth and power swing into motion. This was Dante's world, a place where problems were solved with money and influence, and the kind of resources that could crush ordinary people like insects. She thought of Marcus, alone in the building with his manila folder and his burning need for justice, and felt something that might have been sympathy. "Stop," she said suddenly. Everyone in the room turned to look at her, security specialists and lawyers and public relations experts who were accustomed to deference from people in her position. "This isn't how I want to handle this," Clara continued, her voice steady despite the weight of their attention. "Clara," Dante said carefully, "your brother is trying to destroy everything we've built, everything we could build. This isn't the time for half measures. It's exactly the time for the right measures, and turning you into the kind of man who crushes people who can't fight back isn't the right measure." The room fell silent except for the hum of expensive electronics and the distant sound of London. "Traffic 57 floors below. Clara felt the weight of their stares, the implicit question about who she thought she was, to challenge decisions made by people with more experience, more resources, more power. But she also felt the weight of Dante's attention, the quality of focus that suggested her opinion mattered not just as strategy, but as moral guidance. "What do you suggest?" he asked quietly. "I suggest we go down to the lobby and I talk to my brother. Just me, just him, just the truth about what I've chosen and why." "Absolutely not," the response came from James, Dante's head of security, a lean man with the kind of scars that spoke of violence professionally applied. "We don't know what Mills is planning, what weapons he might have, what kind of backup he might have arranged." "He's my brother," Clara said. "He's angry and hurt and probably desperate. But he's not a killer." "People do things they never thought they were capable of when they're cornered," James replied. Clara thought of her father, of the way violence had been his answer to every frustration, every moment when the world refused to bend to his will. She thought of Rebecca, the girl who had died trying to escape a man who couldn't let go of what he thought belonged to him. But she also thought of Marcus at 14, crying in her arms after their father had beaten him for some imagined slight, the boy who had tried to protect her, even when he was too small to protect himself, the man who had stayed behind to care for a monster because someone had to bear witness to the consequences of unchecked cruelty. "I won't let him hurt you," she said to Dante, "but I won't let you hurt him either. He's the only family I have left, and he's not evil, he's just broken." Dante studied her face with the intensity of someone trying to read a map in a foreign language. Clara could see him calculating risks and benefits, weighing her emotional needs against strategic necessities. "If you insist on doing this," he said finally, "then we do it smart. You talk to him in the lobby where there are cameras and witnesses. My security team maintains distance, but stays ready to intervene. And if things go wrong, if he threatens you or tries to force you into something, you step back and let us handle it." Clara nodded, understanding that this was as much compromise as she was likely to get from a man whose wealth and power had been built on controlling variables and minimizing risks. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. This could still go very wrong." They rode the elevator down 57 floors in silence, Clara's hand in Dante's like an anchor in rough seas. She could feel his tension in the set of his shoulders, the careful control he maintained over breathing and heartbeat, and all the biological processes that betrayed fear. The lobby of Argenta Tower was a cathedral of marble and steel, designed to inspire awe and intimidation in equal measure. Clara spotted Marcus immediately. He was standing near the information desk, trying to look casual, but radiating the particular energy of someone who was barely containing volcanic rage. He looked older than Clara remembered, worn down by years of carrying anger like a stone in his chest. His clothes were expensive but slightly wrong, the kind of designer knockoffs that suggested access to money, but not understanding of how wealthy people actually dressed. Everything about him screamed try hard, and Clara felt a pang of sympathy for the boy, who had never learned that respect couldn't be purchased. "There," she said, pointing him out to Dante. "I see him. Are you sure about this?" Clara looked at her half-brother, at the man who shared her DNA and her trauma, but not her choices about how to heal from it. She thought of all the ways their conversation could go wrong, all the potential for destruction that lived in the space between them. But she also thought of the alternative, watching Dante destroy Marcus with the casual efficiency of someone who had learned to eliminate threats, turning love into another kind of violence, allowing fear to make decisions that would haunt them both. "I'm sure." Clara walked across the lobby with steady steps, aware of Dante's security team positioning themselves around the perimeter, aware of cameras recording every movement, aware that whatever happened next would define not just her relationship with Marcus, but her understanding of who she wanted to be in the world. Marcus saw her coming and straightened, his expression shifting from predatory anticipation to something more complex, relief maybe, or disappointment that she was approaching on her own rather than being dragged. "Hello, Clara, Marcus." They stood facing each other in the center of the lobby, two people shaped by the same cruelties, but molded into entirely different forms. Clara could see their father in Marcus's jawline, in the way he held his shoulders like he was preparing for a fight. But she could also see their mother in his eyes, the particular brand of sadness that came from loving people who couldn't love themselves. "You're early," Marcus said. "So are you. I was hoping we could talk privately before tomorrow's deadline." "We're talking now." Marcus glanced around the lobby, taking in the marble columns and expensive fixtures and general atmosphere of wealth that made people like them feel small by design. "This is his world, Clara, not ours. You don't belong here. I belong wherever I choose to belong. And you choose this? This man who profits from chaos, who builds fortunes on other people's suffering." Clara thought of the documents in Marcus's folder, of the way truth could be weaponized by framing and context, of the difference between facts and understanding. "I choose the man who told me the truth about his worst moments and trusted me to judge him fairly. I choose the man who has spent 4 years trying to atone for an impossible decision in an impossible situation. I choose the man who offered to disappear quietly if I decided to destroy him. He's a killer, Clara. So was our father. But you stayed with him until the end." The comparison hit Marcus like a physical blow, and Clara saw him flinch as if she had struck him. That was different. "How?" "He was family. Family isn't an excuse for evil, Marcus. And it's not a reason to choose revenge over healing." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. When he spoke again, his voice was rougher, more vulnerable. "Do you know what it was like? After you left, watching him destroy everything he touched and not being able to stop it, being the only one who remembered Rebecca, who carried the weight of what he did to her." Clara felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. "I know what it was like to choose survival over staying. I know what it was like to build a life on the foundation of running away. But Marcus, what you're planning, destroying Dante, won't bring Rebecca back. It won't undo what our father did. It will just create more destruction. Some people deserve to be destroyed, maybe, but not by us. Not in her name." Clara reached into her bag and pulled out a photograph, one she had carried for 13 years but never shown to anyone. It was Rebecca at 16, laughing at something off camera, her honey-colored hair catching sunlight like spun gold. "This is how I remember her," Clara said, holding the photograph so Marcus could see it. "Not as a victim, not as a tragedy, but as a girl who deserved better than what our father gave her. If we want to honor her memory, we do it by being better than he was, by choosing healing over revenge, building over destroying." Marcus stared at the photograph with an expression that might have been longing or grief or both. Clara could see the moment when his anger cracked open, revealing the pain underneath raw and immediate, and still bleeding after all these years. "I don't know how to let go," he whispered. "Neither do I, but I'm learning." Clara looked across the lobby and found Dante watching them with the careful attention of someone who understood that he was witnessing something fragile and important. Their eyes met, and she saw in his expression not just love but trust, faith that she would find the right words, make the right choices, navigate this minefield with the wisdom that came from understanding rather than strategy. "There's something else," Clara said, turning back to Marcus. "Something I haven't told you." "What?" Clara took a deep breath and felt herself standing at the edge of another precipice, another moment where truth would either build bridges or burn them. "I think I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Marcus stared at her as if she had just spoken in a foreign language, his expression cycling through surprise, confusion, and something that might have been understanding. "His?" "Yes." "How long?" "I don't know for certain. A few weeks, maybe. I haven't been to a doctor yet." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, processing this new information and its implications for whatever revenge fantasy he had been constructing. "And you're telling me because?" "Because if you destroy him, you destroy the future I'm trying to build. Not just for me, but for my child. And because despite everything, despite all the ways our father poisoned the idea of family, I still believe that blood matters, that we have a choice about what kind of family we become." Clara watched her half-brother struggle with competing impulses, the need for revenge that had driven him for years, and the recognition that his actions would hurt not just Dante, but her, and potentially an innocent child who had done nothing to deserve the consequences of their family's toxic legacy. "What are you asking me to do?" Marcus said finally, "I'm asking you to walk away, to find another way to heal from what our father did that doesn't require destroying what I'm trying to build." And in exchange, Clara thought of all the ways she could bargain with him, all the promises she could make about maintaining contact or helping him find closure. But she had learned that the most powerful negotiations were based on truth rather than transaction, in exchange for nothing. "I'm asking you to make the right choice because it's right, not because it benefits you." Marcus laughed, but the sound held more pain than humor. "You always were the idealist, and you always were the protector. You stayed behind to take care of someone who didn't deserve it, because you believed family meant something. I'm asking you to protect me now the same way." The request reframed everything, not as a choice between justice and love, but as a choice between different kinds of family loyalty. Clara could see Marcus weighing the options, calculating the emotional mathematics of obligation and affection. Finally, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila envelope, thicker than the folder Clara had seen, more comprehensive and damaging. "This contains everything," he said. "Military records, financial documents, witness testimony, photographs. Enough to destroy him completely." He held the envelope for a moment as if testing its weight, then handed it to Clara with the ceremonial precision of someone laying down arms. "I can't promise I'll never try again," he said. "I can't promise I'll learn to forgive or forget or move on, but I can promise that I won't hurt you or your child to get my revenge." Clara took the envelope with trembling hands, understanding that she was holding not just documents but the future, the difference between the life she could build and the ruins of the life that would be left after Marcus's bombs went off. "Thank you," she said, though the words felt inadequate to the magnitude of what he had just given her. "Don't thank me, just be happy, Clara. Be the kind of happy that makes all this suffering mean something." Marcus turned to leave, then paused and looked back at her one more time. "If he ever hurts you, if he ever makes you regret choosing him over family, I'll kill him myself." The threat was delivered, with the casual certainty of someone stating a law of physics, and Clara understood that Marcus was not giving up his anger so much as redirecting it. Dante would be safe as long as he made her happy, but the moment he failed in that obligation, her half-brother would become the most dangerous enemy he had ever faced. "He won't hurt me," Clara said with a confidence that surprised her. "How can you be sure?" Clara looked across the lobby at Dante, at the man who had shown her his worst truths and trusted her to judge him fairly, who had offered to sacrifice himself for her safety, who had looked at her like she was the answer to a question he had been asking his entire life. "Because he loves me," she said simply. "Really loves me in the way that makes hurting me impossible." Marcus nodded as if this made perfect sense, then walked away without looking back, disappearing into the London night like a ghost finally ready to stop haunting the places where his pain had been born. Clara stood alone in the lobby for a moment, holding the envelope that contained Dante's destruction and feeling the weight of choices that could not be undone. Then she walked to the nearest trash bin and dropped the envelope inside, watching years of research and revenge turn into garbage with the simple act of letting go. Dante appeared at her side as if materialized from shadow, his presence solid and reassuring and real. "It's over?" he asked. "It's over. And you're certain?" About the pregnancy, Clara realized that he had heard everything, had witnessed the entire negotiation from whatever distance his security team had maintained. The thought should have embarrassed her, but instead she felt relieved that there were no more secrets between them, no more hidden truths waiting to surface at inconvenient moments. "I think so. I'll know for certain tomorrow." Dante was quiet for a moment, processing the magnitude of what she had just told him. When he spoke again, his voice was rough with emotion. "Clara, if you're pregnant, if we're going to have a child, I need you to know that I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of that responsibility. Of you, of the family we could build together." The promise hit Clara like sunlight after rain, warming parts of her that had been cold for so long she had forgotten they could feel anything else. "I know," she said, and meant it. They left Argenta Tower together, walking out into the London night as equals, as partners, as two people who had chosen each other despite all the reasons why they shouldn't. Above them, The city stretched out in all directions like a constellation of possibilities, its ancient stones holding the weight of 10 million stories about love and loss, choice and consequence, the terrible, beautiful mathematics of human hearts trying to find their way home. 3 months later, Clara stood in the bathroom of Dante's penthouse apartment, their apartment now, staring at a pregnancy test that confirmed what her body had been telling her for weeks. She was carrying life inside her, a future built from love rather than fear, hope rather than survival. When she emerged from the bathroom, she found Dante in the kitchen making breakfast, with the careful attention he brought to everything he considered precious. He looked up when she entered, and she saw the question in his eyes before he could voice it. "Yes," she said simply. The smile that broke across his face was like watching the sun rise over a landscape that had been dark for too long. He crossed the distance between them in 2 steps, gathering her into his arms with the reverence of someone holding something miraculous. "We're going to have a baby," he said, as if testing the words for weight and meaning. "We're going to have a family," Clara corrected, and felt the truth of it settle into her bones like warmth. 6 months later, Clara Mills, now Clara Ferraz, stood in the nursery of their home in Hampstead, watching Dante assemble a crib with the focused intensity he brought to all important projects. Her belly was round with their daughter, a child who would be born into love rather than violence, safety rather than chaos, possibility rather than limitation. "Tell me again," Clara said, settling into the rocking chair Dante had bought from a craftsman in Scotland. "Tell you what, Thursday we'll tea some Dante, about the future, about what kind of life we're going to give her." Dante looked up from the crib hardware, his storm-grey eyes bright with something that might have been joy or hope or both. "We're going to give her the kind of childhood that teaches her she's worthy of love without conditions. We're going to show her that strength comes from choosing kindness when cruelty would be easier. We're going to raise her to understand that family isn't about blood or obligation, but about choosing to build something beautiful with the people who see you clearly and love you anyway." Clara felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, though whether from happiness or hormones she couldn't tell. "And what about us? What kind of life are we going to have?" Dante abandoned the crib and came to kneel beside her chair, placing his hands on her belly where their daughter was growing. "We're going to have the kind of life that makes all the suffering that brought us together worth it. We're going to love each other loudly and fiercely and without apology. We're going to fight sometimes and make up always. We're going to build something real and lasting and good, even though we come from broken places, especially because we come from broken places. We know the difference between what we want to build and what we want to leave behind." Clara placed her hands over his, feeling the flutter of movement beneath their palms, their daughter already restless, already eager to enter the world they were creating for her. "I love you," she said, the words carrying the weight of choice and commitment and the kind of certainty that came from being seen completely and loved anyway. "I love you too," Dante replied, and kissed her palm like it was a promise he intended to keep for the rest of his life. Outside their window, London hummed with its eternal symphony of ambition and heartbreak, beauty and brutality, the endless dance of human hearts trying to find their way home. But inside their house in Hampstead, Clara and Dante Ferraz built something that had never existed before in either of their lives, a love that was stronger than the sum of their fears, a family that was chosen rather than inherited, a future that was bright enough to illuminate all the dark places they had traveled to find each other. They had both been broken when they met, fractured by violence and loss, and the particular cruelties that shape people who learn too young that the world is not safe. But they had chosen to heal together, to build something beautiful from the ruins of what they used to be. And in the end, that choice, to love despite risk, to trust despite evidence, to hope despite experience, was the only revolution that mattered. It was the kind of quiet rebellion that changed the world one heart at a time, one family at a time, one love story at a time. Clara Mills had been invisible for 29 years. Clara Ferraz would spend the rest of her life being seen, being known, being loved for exactly who she was, not despite her scars, but because of them, because they had made her strong enough to recognize true love when it appeared wearing the face of a broken man who was trying to become whole. Their daughter was born on a Tuesday in spring, when London was green with new growth and bright with possibility. They named her Hope, not because it was pretty, but because it was true. She was their hope made manifest, their future given form, their love transformed into something that would outlast them both. And as Clara held her daughter for the first time, looking into eyes that were the same storm grey as her father's, she understood that this was how healing really worked, not by forgetting the past, but by creating a future so beautiful that the past lost its power to define them. Love, she realized, was not about finding someone who completed you. It was about finding someone who saw you clearly enough to help you complete yourself. And in Dante's arms, surrounded by their daughter's soft breathing and the promise of all the tomorrows they would build together, Clara finally understood what it meant to be home.